Hello, I'm Grandmaster Alejandro Ramirez, here to give you the action of Game 5 of the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Today was a game where the challenger definitely had his chances, but a couple of inaccuracies did not allow him to fully convert. Let's jump in the action and see what happened. Today's game started again with the Spanish. Jan remains faithful to a system that's given him some good positions. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castles, and a4. And so far we're following the game 3 match between these two players. And it is actually slightly surprising that it was Magnus Carlsen that decided to deviate before his opponent. The normal lines in this position run along the moves b4 and bishop b7, and they're certainly the most popular moves. Bishop b7 was the one that Magnus essayed a couple of games ago. It was a bit surprising that he chose a different path, and that he chose a path which is relatively untrodden. Rook b8 is a move that the world champion has employed before. He used it against none other than Jean-Christophe Duda in the World Cup game of this year. However, despite getting that draw, it was surprising that Magnus was able to repeat this variation, considering the fact that a lot of engines did not really appreciate the move rook b8, and because it would no longer come as a surprise to his rival, as of course he had used it recently. However, after rook b8, Jan did not seem surprised at all. He very quickly blitzed out a takes b5, a takes b5, and h3. And it is very likely that this is the move that Magnus didn't really fully consider in his preparation. Previously, we've seen variations with the move c3, after which Magnus has played the move d5, takes, takes, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, and c6. Again, with this kind of Marshall Gambit type of compensation, in which it's true that black is down a pawn, but you can see that the development that white has on the queen side is less than satisfactory, and very quickly black can try to play something along the lines of bishop d6 and queen h4 and start pressuring on the king side. Now, is this full compensation? That still remains to be seen, but Jan was not interested in this at all. Instead, he played the move h3, which is a typical anti-Marshall move in another move order. If you go back to the position here after castle, many players no longer try the move c3 because after d5, pawn takes, knight takes, we get to the Marshall Gambit that has been essayed over and over and over again through dozens and dozens of years, and the current theoretical debate has more or less ended with the result being that black is fully okay. In that scenario, after castles, many people try the move h3 simply to avoid the Marshall Gambit, and in this case, after inserting the moves a4, rook b8, takes, takes, h3, this makes again a lot of sense. The sacrifices with d5 don't really make as many waves as in the other variations, simply because you will have access to the move knight c3 later on, and this is a much more harmonious way of developing for white. Therefore, after h3, Magnus played the more sedate move d6, but this didn't stop Jan from blitzing his moves. c3, quickly Magnus played b4, d3, and this is a curious little move. I like this in the Spanish, that you have the ability to play something slightly more positional with the move d3, or try to go for the throat with the move d4 right away, trying to expand on the center immediately, pushing the pawn twice or 2 squares. But in this case, I think the move d3 is actually a little bit more dangerous. The reason is that this bishop on e7 is actually rather bad when the queen side opens. In many variations of the closed Spanish, it doesn't really matter that the bishop on e7 can't transfer over to the queen side, but because in this kind of positions the queen side is opening so quickly, it's going to be a difference that's very, very felt. If you play the move d4, instead of playing on the queen side, you're more essaying an attack in the center, and in the case, the bishop on e7 might have a more useful role, especially if you imagine that the pawns on e5 get traded. For this reason, and for some tactical issues as well, the move d3 is superior in my opinion, and after pawn takes c3, pawn takes c3, the world champion had a decision to make. He can no longer just develop normally, because his pieces are actually rather bad. This knight on c6 is very heavily controlled by this pawn on c3. You can see that the pawn takes care of this knight's activity. And unlike the Chigorin, you cannot put the knight on a5 because the rook on a1 would simply take it. And unlike the Briar, you cannot retreat the knight to b8 and then maneuver it to d7 because you already put your rook on b8. So this knight on c6, it's a little bit of an issue. You kind of have to solve it at some point, and if you play something normal, let's say with like rook e8 and bishop f8, you'll be running into issues immediately. Rook e8, bishop a4 in many cases will be quite annoying, and white has very harmonious development in this position. He simply wants to play the knight to d2, maybe to f1 and e3, or he wants to develop the bishop to e3 at some point. And for this reason, Magnus decides, okay, I need to solve the problem with the bishop. I am going to break in the center with the move d5, which I think is well timed, but does not fully solve Black's problems, as we're about to see. Nepo was unfazed by this decision and still played quickly. Knight bd2, after which Magnus replied with the logical sequence d takes e4, d takes e4, and bishop d6. This bishop is an interesting one. It's more or less a big pawn. All it does is really defend the pawn chain. But on the other hand, it does solidify Black's position, which is not an ambitious one at all. Black simply is sitting back, saying, my position is solid, you're not going to be able to rip it apart anytime soon. I don't need to go crazy, I don't need to activate all of my pieces. I'm going to be more or less okay. However, I think that the issue in this position, as I was talking with Grandmaster Hans Niemann about, is actually the bishop on b3. This bishop on b3 is rather powerful on this diagonal, and it's very difficult for Black to challenge it. We'll see that Black would love to play a move like queen e7 and bishop e6, but it's not going to be trivial to do so. Let's see how Nepo tries to squeeze this position out. I believe that he has already a very, very small advantage in this position simply because of the fact that his pieces are more active. The bishop on b3 is better than its counterpart, the bishop on d6 is more or less a big pawn, and Black is playing for being absolutely solid more than for any kind of counterplay. After the move queen c2, h6 was played, which is a very logical move. You can't really allow this knight to come to g5 in the variations where Black decides to put a rook on e8. And now the maneuvers. Knight f1 I think is a great move, and in this particular position the engines were showing equality, and I was very surprised about that. Why were they showing equality in this position? And it was an absolutely, to me, stunning way of removing this bishop from b3. I was having trouble trying to figure out a way for Black to defend this square on e6 for the bishops to get traded. For example, a move like queen e7 can be met with simply knight e3, bishop e6, and already after knight d5 or even knight f5, Black's position becomes extremely awkward. There's no good way of capturing the knight because pawn takes d5 will come with a tempo, the knight doesn't have a good retreat square, and e5 will be targetable. So I thought the Black was worse here, but the engines come up with a very clever plan. Since the e-file is not a very convenient way for Black to exchange these bishops, whether with queen e7 or rook e8 or queen e8, the engines are suggesting instead to put the bishop on d7, put the queen on c8, and then, and only then, put the bishop on e6. The queen on c8 is actually much better placed because it's not as vulnerable to this rook on e1 in the case that the e-file opens up. And it also, in many cases, hints at a sacrifice on h3, which in many cases might be enough to hold a draw by forcing a perpetual. Bishop d7 would have been a great move, but it's no surprise that Carlsen wasn't really able to find it, and instead plays a logical move. I was talking earlier about the problems of this knight on c6, and he decides to solve it immediately. Knight e7, knight g3, and knight g6. The knight transfers to the king side and is now in a position where it can put pressure on his opponent by playing the move knight f4. However, it's not easy to execute this move because this bishop is always eyeing this square, and there will be a follow-up, although maybe not immediate, of the move e5. Bishop e3 was played, simply removing the bishop from the last rank, and queen e8 is an important move. The reason, again, Carlsen needs to exchange this bishop on the light squares, and he's preparing to do so. He plays the move queen e8 with the idea of bishop e6, and I think that this was a critical moment of the game. Jan Nepomniachtchi certainly thought that he had a small edge in this position, or at least an edge, and he must have tried to figure out the best way to continue and keep that pressure up. I think it would have been really important for him to keep this bishop on b3 alive and not allow Magnus to challenge it immediately. There's a couple of ways to do so, but I think the most pressing one was with the move c4. The move c4 immediately puts pressure on black's position, intending something along the lines of the move c5, after which the bishop doesn't have too many retreat squares. And in the case that black challenges the control of that square by putting his own pawn on c5, he runs into a couple of issues. The move bishop a4 would be very dangerous in this position. Now that this pawn and this pawn are here, it's a different scenario. You don't want to trade bishops with the black pieces, because if you go bishop d7 and I trade, the knight could come to f5, the d5 square is weak, the rook will be coming to d1 and then pressuring down on this file, and things would start to look really ugly for the black side. Not to mention, the bishop on d6 really does not appreciate the move c5. And if the queen moves to e7, then this bishop maneuvers to c6, where it would jump to the d5 protected square. Difficult for black to ever take it and claim equality, and white is simply in the driver's seat. You can compare the power of a bishop on d5 compared to the lame bishop on d6. Instead of that, Jan, I think, was unable to really appreciate the position fully and play the move rook ed1, which is certainly an inaccuracy. After this move, black is able to exchange the light square's bishops, and although he retains a very passive position, it's still a very holdable one. After bishop e6, bishop a4, bishop d7, Jan spent a lot of time here trying to figure out a way to continue, trying to figure out a way to put pressure on his opponent. And even though it's certainly a position in which every grandmaster would prefer to be white, why? Because you have a little bit more space advantage, the knight is coming to f5, the pieces flow more naturally. It's difficult to say exactly where the penetration squares are going to be, or what the huge difference between piece activity is going to be. And indeed, after the move knight d2, which was played after a long think, bishop takes a4, queen takes a4, queen takes f4, rook takes a4. It was like a vacuum cleaner came to the board. A lot of pieces have left, the space advantage is less significant, and Carlsen had no problem defending this position. It is certainly true that he's still under pressure. The bishop on d6 is not as good as its counterpart on e3, and the weakness on e5 and c7 are certainly easier to reach than the weaknesses, or let's call them weaknesses, on c3 and e4. But this isn't really an issue. After the move rook a8, exchanging even more pieces, rook a1, rook takes, rook takes, rook b8, Carlsen simply approached this position as if he was a turtle, simply just going into his shell and saying, "You're not going to get me." And it worked perfectly. Rook a6, knight e8, king f1, and knight f8. And look at how he's playing. Knights all the way back, no shame in putting the pieces on the last rank. But it's impossible to penetrate in this position. The bishop on d6 is solidly defended. It's really a bastion of protection. It's defending c7 and e5. The knight is maneuvering to e6, where it's going to have a really nice square, controlling c5, controlling f4. And even though after knight f5, knight e6, knight c4, white's position looks menacing, there are no really concrete threats. The rook comes to d8, again solidifying this bishop, and slowly Carlsen is going to come out of that shell. He's going to play the move f6, he's going to play the move king f7, and eventually he will be ready to use the rook in an active fashion. And indeed, that's more or less what happens. Nepo tries to expand on the king side with f3, f6, g4, king f7, h4. But it doesn't really accomplish very much. The move g5, which is the natural break, does nothing at all, and it's very difficult to execute. As soon as you put the pawn there, black will be happy to take twice. So Carlsen simply retreats his bishop to f8, removing it from the vulnerable square. It is not needed neither to defend the pawn on e5 anymore, as that is the job of the f6 pawn, nor to defend the pawn on c7, because the knights are very solidly defending on that square. So after king e2, even the move knight d6, removing the final knight from the back rank, simplify the position further. Knight c takes d6 check, bishop takes d6, and now if you take on d6, basically white runs out of pieces. There aren't enough pieces to put any kind of pressure in this position, so Nepo at least tried the move h5, making sure that this is a permanent weakness on g7 that can be attacked by the knight on f5, but it's simply insufficient. There are not enough pieces to create any real problems. Black's pieces on f7 and e6 basically solidify the entire king side, and there's no way to make any kind of progress. After the move bishop f8, although visually white's position is preferable, the truth is that this is just an equal endgame, and Magnus simply activates his final move, rook, with rook a5, king e8, rook d5, and rook a8. Coming down on the a file, trying to harass the white king, trying to get behind the pawns, and by this point it's obvious that the game is going to end in a draw. And indeed it did with the threefold repetition after rook d1, rook a2 check, rook d2, rook a1, rook d1, rook a2 check, rook d2, rook a1, and finally again rook d1. I would say that both teams are going to be slightly unhappy with today's game. Certainly Team Carlsen cannot be happy that Nepomniachtchi was able to get a position where his opponent was pressured, where he had the space advantage, where he had the more pleasant game, that if anyone was going to be better, it was white. On the other hand, Team Nepo must feel that this was a good chance to put real pressure on the world champion, but it didn't feel like he was in real danger at any point, and that most of the chances were left on the analysis board rather than on the real board. Certainly Magnus happier with the draw, and with a rest day coming up, it'll be interesting to see how Team Carlsen tries to solve the problems in the Ruy Lopez that he surely will face 3 days from now. We'll see what happens then. Until then, let's enjoy the rest day.